Okay, brilliant. And we'll let people in if they're coming a little bit late as the presentation goes on. But welcome everyone. It's really great to have so many of you on the call for this webinar. I'm Zach. I work on our ethical finance campaign, specifically a campaign called Invest for Change, which is all about pushing universities to invest their money as ethically and sustainably as possible. And so I'm going to attempt in 45 minutes to an hour to try and cover the very broad topic of this webinar, which is how the financial system entrenches climate and social injustice and how we can transform it to build a just and sustainable future, with a focus on the education sector, but going broader as well. So feel free at any point to raise your hand and jump in with questions. Hopefully Fran or I will spot you, but if we don't spot your hand being raised, just shout out. And Fran can maybe keep an eye on the chat. And if there are any questions at any point, Fran, just let me know and I can try and answer them as I go. So we'll get cracking. Okay, so I guess to start, it's important to think about exactly what the financial system is, which sounds, I guess, like a simple point, but we all have slightly different ideas and there are lots of different definitions. So I guess when I was thinking about putting this presentation together, the way I thought we can really broadly and loosely define it is it comprises a really wide range of interconnected institutions and also processes. And this isn't an exhaustive list, but it includes individuals, you and I, individuals as citizens who vote in government, individuals as workers who work in the financial system, individuals as consumers. It also comprises, of course, our governments, which set regulations and legislation that constrain our financial system or push our financial system into certain shapes and certain having certain priorities. The natural world, I think this one is one that often gets missed out, but obviously for the sort of purpose of this call is really vital. The financial system is built on a living, breathing planet that is obviously suffering quite badly the impacts of climate breakdown and biodiversity loss. But it's inextricable from the economic system that sits on top of the natural world and that we all interact with every day. Companies, so your Shells, your BPs, your Barclays, your well, we've had the Body Shop today, news about it going into administration. So the companies that we all interact with in various different ways as consumers, as people existing within the financial system. Investors, we'll touch on the different types of investors throughout this session, but the people or institutions who put up money to and invest it in particular companies or projects. Banks, large financial institutions, which also do a lot of investing in other financial services. Financial markets, so things like the stock market, where shares in major companies are bought and sold. So the financial system comprises a lot of different elements and a lot of different processes. And I want to talk about, I guess, why change in the financial system is important when we're thinking about sustainability, climate justice, social inequality. And I think this fact here is one that has been really helpful for me in my thinking about the climate crisis and the financial system, because what it shows very clearly is just 100 companies are responsible for 71% of global emissions. Which is quite a sobering fact. Such a small number of organizations, large financial institutions, are responsible for a massive proportion, an overwhelming majority of global emissions, the pollution that is causing global heating, that is causing huge health problems for so many people around the world, and a host of other really serious impacts that we think about and talk about all the time in terms of climate impacts. So 100 companies are responsible for just 71% of those overall global emissions. So the financial system is relevant to these companies because these companies don't exist in a vacuum. They are enabled by and supported by a web of different financial actors, whether that be the governments that might grant the licenses for new oil and gas, for instance, or the investors who provide new capital to those projects. So there is an entire financial system that is having a huge impact on our living world and on driving the climate crisis to the point that we see it today. I wanted to bring it, I guess, back to earth a bit, because it's such a vast area and we talk about so many different aspects of the financial system in relation to the climate crisis. But I think it's important just at the start to kind of ground ourselves in the context of universities, for instance, and then hopefully that can act as a bit of a case study for some of the things we're going to talk about. So if we think about the financial system in action on a university level, this is just a sketch of some of the financial relationships that universities have with this wider kind of web of institutions and processes. But I'll walk you through the diagram, and please do shout if you've got any questions. So if we start with universities themselves, they are connected to the investment system in three kind of main ways. There are loads of others, but these are at least three of the ways that I think is important to focus on and that kind of ties in with a lot of the work going on in the sector. So endowments is maybe one that people have heard of and feel comfortable with already. So when alumni and others donate to the university, that money goes into what's known as the university's endowment. Some universities have huge endowments. Oxford has about £6 billion in its endowment. And that money then gets invested for the long-term, for long-term uses to support the university's mission. But it doesn't get invested by the university itself. You don't have the university vice-chancellor or the head of finance even doing that investing day to day, because it's a huge job with that amount of money, requires a lot of expertise. So actually the people doing the investing on the day-to-day basis are investment managers. Now I wonder, some of you on the call may have heard of companies like BlackRock, Vanguard, there's loads of them, Saracens, Cazenove. A lot of you won't have heard of those companies in the same way as you might have heard of Shell or BP. But these are investment management companies, investment management firms, and they have a huge amount of power in terms of determining where investments are made around the world. But often people aren't very aware of them as institutions. So you might know that the University of Oxford has an investment portfolio, but you might not know who manages that investment portfolio. And those are the people making quite significant day-to-day decisions about how that university's money is being invested. So universities pass on their endowments to be managed by investment managers, usually according to an investment policy that the university has set. And then those investment managers invest that money. They make the actual investments. So they might invest some of that money in shares, so part ownership of a company. So you might have a share in Rolls-Royce, for instance. You might invest in bonds, which is a form of long-term loan that companies can take out. Or you might invest in property. Cambridge, there's a Cambridge college, I think Trinity College has, or famously at one point did own the O2 Arena or part of the O2 Arena. So investment managers invest on behalf of universities into these various types of investments, which then kind of live in the real world, if you want to think about it like that. Rolls-Royce makes cars that we use. The O2 Arena is somewhere that we would go to and buy tickets to go to concerts there. So there is a real impact of this money in our daily lives in the UK and around the world, depending on where you're investing. That money then may make a profit. The company you're invested in may make a profit. The buildings you're invested in may receive good rent, and in the form of rent in the form of a return on investment, which then gets funneled back into the university and either reinvested or used for some sort of purpose. A lot of universities, for instance, would talk about using their endowment for bursaries or other kind of student-focused activities. So that's endowments. Then you've got pensions. All of us on this call probably will have a contribution going to a pension scheme. So Universities also have pension schemes for their staff. Those also go to investment managers, and the same process happens again. They invest on behalf of the pension scheme in companies, in bonds and property, in order to grow the pension pot over time. And then the universities, of course, also have relationships with banks in the same way that we all have a bank account. The universities have relationships with the major UK and sometimes international banks, who then, we often think about our money in a bank as being sort of safe in a piggy bank that doesn't go anywhere. But of course, those banks are investing our money all of the time in similar ways to investment managers. So that's just a kind of sketch of, I guess, how our universities are enmeshed in this wider financial system that we all know has a lot of power in terms of the direction of our economy, and big implications on things like the climate crisis and other social and environmental issues we care a lot about. And to kind of put a bit of a finer point on this, why is this relevant to climate and social injustice? So I've got two images here. I guess maybe one positive, one negative. So the first one is around the government handing out lots of new oil and gas licenses in the North Sea. As we all know, as the scientists are sort of screaming at us at this point, new fossil fuel projects cannot go ahead. They just can't go ahead if we have any chance of meeting international climate targets. But when you have a government that is granting those licenses, that is sending a really strong signal to the financial system to make investments in that area. So you might not think governments and legislation might not be the first thing that comes to mind when you think about the financial system, but there's a really strong interplay between the market and sort of more obvious financial actors like banks and companies and the kind of legislative ecosystem that they exist within. So that's on the negative side. And then another news story about Nissan tripling investment in electric vehicle production in the UK. So companies, the decisions they make based on the kind of policy conditions in the country and other factors has a huge bearing on what sustainable choices are or aren't available for us as consumers. I think we think a lot about trying to make as many sustainable choices as possible as individuals, but often that's determined by what's available and what companies are choosing to provide, choosing to market towards us, and so on. So the financial system determines which industries do and don't get investment. Is there enough investment going into massively scaling up renewable energy, for instance? Or is most of the investment still going towards fossil fuel production? Are exploitative, environmentally destructive activities permitted? Are they legal? Is there a really sort of weak legislation and regulation system in place in the country that the company might be operating in? Which products are available and affordable to the public? Are there subsidies for particular, production of electric cars, for instance, which is still very expensive? And which economic outcomes, kind of on a more philosophical level, are most prioritized? So are we thinking about what's sort of often talked about as quarterly capitalism, short-term profit making for companies, bottom line? Or are we thinking about the long-term outcomes that really enable human flourishing and ecological flourishing? And also, who owns assets? So our property, for instance, the housing that we're living in, often is that owned by someone who is using that as an asset to try and achieve some sort of profit for shareholders, perhaps on quite a short-term basis, or is owned by an entity that is really committed to super high quality, affordable housing? And the ownership of an asset, of course, determines hugely how that asset gets managed, gets ran. So our economic system, I think it's kind of evident from the world that we live in and the news that we're all consuming every day. It drives climate breakdown and social injustice in various ways, which we're going to get to. But if we just think about some of the think it's useful sometimes to zoom out into the realities of the world that we live in. So we've got a few images. The first one is of Elon Musk, who I've got in there because I want to sort of touch on the wealth inequality that we're seeing in the world. Elon Musk is obviously a billionaire, one of the richest men in the world. I think he might have just been overtaken, but he sort of hovers up between the richest and second wealthiest man in the world. But the trend that I'm trying to, I guess, expose is that there is a huge concentration of wealth at the top, which is actually increasing. So, for instance, over the course of the pandemic, the number of billionaires in the UK increased by 20% just since the pandemic. So we're living in a world with increasing inequality, which has all sorts of implications for social cohesion, people being able to afford basic living standards, that sort of thing. Deforestation. So a lot of the business models that dominate in our current financial system rely on kind of a non-circular, you could call it, business model whereby they gobble up resources like the finite, resources that cannot renew themselves as quickly as we're using them up, like the Amazon rainforest, rather than adopting a business model that exists within planetary boundaries and planetary limits. So I think in 2022, every minute, 11 football pitches worth of rainforest were deforested, and that's of course a completely unsustainable ecological impact. This image is from the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is quite famously somewhere where many of the resources used in lots of our kind of modern devices, phones, for instance, are mined. But as you can see, these are lots of young children who are often implicated in the supply chains of some of these resources, and whether or not businesses look very carefully at their supply chains or care very much about where their resources in their products are coming from depends a lot on the kind of financial system that they're operating within. And then this picture is from the Pakistan floods in 2022, which impacted 33 million people in that country. A really unprecedented level of climate impact. And that's, of course, a direct effect of the climate crisis, where we're pouring way too many greenhouse gases into our atmosphere, which is heating the planet and causing these really dangerous impacts. So we're living in a world that has increasing inequality. There's lots of exploitation of people and planet. And that isn't happening just randomly. It's happening partly because of the economic system that we are all kind of interlinked with, and that dominates a lot of how our lives and our societies are structured. It can all feel a little bit abstract and a bit scary and massive, but I want to go to an example which might help explain things a bit more concretely. So I want to talk about pensions. I don't know if anyone wants to have a guess of all the investment that happens in the UK, how much comes from pension fund investments. There's anyone in the chat who wants to give a percentage figure? I can't see the chat, so I'm gonna, oh no, I can, 1 second. 40%, 70%. Okay, yeah, 50. So Alex has got it. Yeah, so it's 50% of all the investment in the UK is coming from our pension savings. And I think that's quite a shocking figure, because we think about our pensions kind of, they're sort of locked away. We're going to access them, well, depending on when our retirement age is by the time we retire, but in our 70s. And we don't think loads about when, where that money actually is going in the meantime. And it's not just locked away in a piggy bank. It is being invested actively in today's world and today's economy. And therefore, it's building, in a very real sense, the future world that we're going to retire into. If you're investing our pensions in companies that are furthering climate breakdown or social inequality, then we're going to retire it. We're much more likely to retire into a world that suffers from those phenomena even worse than we do today. So if we think about the real world impact, what kinds of companies are standard funds invested in? Maybe again in the chat, that if people want to name either sectors or specific companies that you would expect to typically see in a pension investment fund. Yeah. Tracker funds, FTSE 100. Yeah, all true. So bonds might be issued by companies or governments. FTSE 100, so the biggest 100 companies, global equities, yeah. And in terms of some specific names, so the FTSE 100, again, feels very abstract. It's one of those buzz terms that can switch a lot of people off when we're thinking about finance. But the FTSE 100 is a list of some of the largest companies with the biggest impact on our economy. And this is just a set of companies that you might be quite likely to see in your pension fund investments. So we've got the classic baddies of the climate movement, and I guess all of our collective well-being in future. But BP and Shell, companies that are planning massive expansion of their fossil fuel activities. Tens of millions of pounds a day planned on new oil and gas projects, and very little being directed towards renewables, very little going towards a transition. These companies, unless you have explicitly asked as an organization to opt out of most of the funds that standard pensions are invested in, you'll probably be, all of our pensions will probably be invested in BP and Shell. Rio Tinto, which might be a name that fewer people know about, but Rio Tinto is a mining company primarily that does it's a huge multinational corporation. But one of the examples that I've just dug out of kind of controversies and things which people have criticized Rio Tinto for is that at one point it blasted open an Aboriginal site to expand one of its iron ores. So there's kind of issues around indigenous rights violations. AstraZeneca and GlaxoSmithKline are big multinational pharmaceutical companies. So these are the companies that had a hand in developing the COVID vaccine. So there's obviously some positive impacts there, but also patented the development of the COVID vaccine so that it became unaffordable for lots of countries in the world to access those vaccines. And then there's BAE Systems, which is pertinent to the kind of horrors that we're seeing unfolding in Gaza at the moment, where BAE Systems and other weapons companies continue to supply countries which are violating human rights. So whether that's Israel or countries like Saudi Arabia, or a whole host of countries where those weapons are going to be used in activities that we might find very objectionable. Quick note on ESG. Probably lots of you will have heard about ESG. It stands for environmental, social, and governance. It's kind of the buzzword for ethical investing in the finance space. And just want to really quickly give you an example of the kinds of companies that tend to be in ESG funds. So you might think, oh, we're in an ESG fund, we're doing okay. But this is the top 10 holdings of Vanguard, one of the largest asset managers, ESG funds. And as you can see, it's not necessarily the company building a better world. It often just excludes the absolute worst companies. So often it will exclude arms companies or fossil fuel companies. But even as you can see from this second image, green investment funds pushing money into fossil fuel firms, lots of ESG funds continue to invest in fossil fuels for some very complex reasons. And there's interesting analysis of ESG that we could get into, but I'll stop there because there's other points I want to cover. But I just caution you not to to dig into any ESG claims because they often are quite dubious. So what sector in the UK do you think has the largest pension scheme? Maybe again, we can have a quick look at the chat if anyone knows. And I was a bit surprised by this. Alex, you're on fire today. Yeah, it's the university sector. So the USS pension scheme is the UK's largest pension scheme. I think it's got about 90 billion. And there's a large campaign at the moment around divesting that pension scheme from fossil fuel companies. So as you can see, there's some information here, but it's still heavily invested in fossil fuel companies. And again, there's that kind of irony of the companies that are making our future more dangerous are also, our pensions are being built on their profits, and our pensions are being invested in them, often without our knowledge. So that's pensions. Asset managers, who I talked about earlier, those companies like BlackRock, Vanguard, that we don't hear a lot about, but have a massive impact on our economy. Like I say, they manage investments on behalf of thousands. Well, a small asset manager will be managing investments on behalf of thousands of individual and institutional investors. And they are making those day-to-day decisions about where to put their money, where not to put their money, whether to challenge companies on bad practice or whether to just sit back and accept the kind of shareholder dividends, a whole host of kind of ethical levers that they do or don't pull. And there's various NGOs working on kind of mapping where the investment management sector is and how well these big asset managers are actually doing in terms of stewarding our investments in an ethical way. And as you can see from this report, the rankings are quite poor. So most of them are in this C to E section. And if we look at the biggest asset managers in the world, so BlackRock, Vanguard, Fidelity, State Street, they're all D, E, and D. And these four, I don't have the exact statistic to hand, but they manage a massive chunk of our global assets. So they really dominate the asset management industry. And yet they're really failing on some key metrics in terms of their ethical practices. Also, we're going to talk about banks. So we've covered pensions, we've covered asset managers a little bit. Banks are also major actors in the financial system that we all have connections to. Our universities have accounts there, we have accounts there. They might be the ones managing mortgages, for instance. And here's a kind of sobering statistic. So I talked earlier about those 100 companies that are responsible for 71% of emissions. Those companies rely on financing, whether that's investment from banks or other financial services from banks in order to carry out their activities. So banks are kind of intimately intertwined with how companies in the economy, who we might be more aware of, conducting either good or bad activities, fossil fuel extraction or something like renewable energy, that is all being supported and enabled by banks. And here's the kind of, I always struggle to read that number because it's got so many zeros, but $5.5 trillion has been pumped into the 60 biggest banks in the world over the last 7 years. And that is the kind of 7 years since the Paris Agreement. So an agreement which really demonstrated the need to move away from fossil fuels. In the years since then, huge amounts of money is being pumped into the fossil fuel industry by our banks. And that unfortunately does include major UK high street banks. So Barclays, NatWest, Lloyds, HSBC, Santander. And Barclays is one of the kind of primary largest financer of fossil fuels in Europe. So another kind of aspect of this, if we're thinking not just about climate injustice, but also other global injustices, this is a graphic from a campaign that's being run at the moment by Palestine Solidarity Campaign and War on Want, two charities, which is around Barclays' heavy investments in companies that are supplying Israel, companies supplying Israel with weapons specifically. There are kind of quite clear international guidelines around selling weapons to countries which have records of repeated human rights abuses and violations of international law. So that applies here, but also applies to lots of other countries. And Barclays continues to provide lots of financing for companies like Elbit Systems, like BAE Systems, which we touched on earlier, which continues to supply many regimes around the world with weaponry which it knows will probably be used or may be used in the violation of international law. So what this means for the real world is that the kind of combination of investment from investment managers on behalf of thousands of investors across the world, financing and investment from banks, the activities of companies, if the priorities of these different actors and the kind of regulatory frameworks that they have to act within are set, are not appropriate or are not ethically minded, then what we have is questionable projects and companies continuing to receive financing for activities which we know are out of line with international climate agreements. So really stark example would be new fossil fuel projects, but also things like deforestation. So companies where they are doing, key to their business model are activities completely out of line with where scientists say we need to be, or where their business model has a really strong track record of exploitation and human rights abuses, things like child labor. If our investment and financial system doesn't say no to providing finances or investment for those companies, and if our governments don't regulate against that kind of activity, then those things will keep happening and our world will continue to suffer from those kind of moral injustices. Companies aren't challenged by their investors. Companies aren't challenged by the banks financing them. They aren't asked those tricky questions. They aren't forced to give assurances around their ethical practices, and they can raise money easily without losing control. And that means that our economy stays the same, stays an economy that is kind of blighted by lots of really severe environmental crises and social crises. So I know I can sometimes be a little bit depressing about all of this stuff, but I promise the next 15 minutes are actually about action and what we can do. So there's kind of multiple different areas of action on an institutional level. So if people on the call are connected with universities or other institutions which have investments or have financial relationships, have public profiles, there's a lot that you can do on an institutional level. There's a lot you can do as well on an individual level. I think that's what's quite exciting about ethical finance, is actually, even though it's about this massive global financial system, which feels immovable and completely dominating and very alienating, actually we all have interactions with it because it's so dominant that we can take action wherever we are based on the relationships we have with that system. And I'll run through some options for that. So asset allocation is the first one. So basically moving your money, and that can be moving your money out of destructive practices and into or into the kind of companies, project areas that are building a just and sustainable future and world. So one of the most prominent examples of asset allocation and moving money away would be the fossil fuel divestment movement, which we've seen over 100 UK universities, that's 72% of the sector, take their investments to their endowments, which we talked about earlier. They've said to their investment managers, we don't want our investments, our endowments being invested at all in the fossil fuel industry. That's massive. And that sends a really strong signal to other investors that the best practice is not to continue providing financing and investment for fossil fuels. So that's on the investment side. We talked about universities also having other financial relationships. So you can divest your pensions and your endowment on the investment side, but also the second article that's linked here is about Cambridge University reportedly possibly dropping Barclays in favor of a greener bank. And this is a project focusing on the banking provider for the university. So the bank that they use to pay their staff, that they might use if they want to take out a loan, changing their principal banking provider to one that refuses to or has policies against financing things like new fossil fuels, which are out of line with international climate science. And for any of you that are connected to a university, this is an initiative that Cambridge are leading on, but lots of other universities are signing up to, where they're putting out what's called a request for proposals, where they're asking different financial institutions to pitch for the business of the university, and they need to provide assurances that they can meet all of the kind of complex financial needs of the institution, but also that they have strong policies against financing for fossil fuel expansion specifically. So that's a kind of public request for proposals that Cambridge are leading on, and other universities can sign up to. So I'll put my email will be there at the end of the presentation. And if you're interested in this at your institution, you can email me and I'll send you some details. Then there's asset allocation and moving your money as an individual. So if you don't have power over your institution, or you don't have time to try and push a university to divest or to move bank, you can also move your bank. So I've got a few resources that are highlighted here. So one of them is Switch It Green, which is a platform that I'll just pop in the chat. That allows you to switch your I think I'll send around the resources actually at the end, because then I won't be trying to do two things at once. But Switch It Green is a platform where you can switch your bank if you're currently banking with one of those major high street banks which we talked about, providing financing for fossil fuel expansion, and you want to move to a greener bank. It's really easy to do so. And it's a really, really simple but massively impactful action that you can take if you're feeling a bit powerless and a bit frustrated about, what can I do concretely to make an impact, moving your bank account, and crucially telling the bank why, notifying them that you've moved and telling them why is a super, super impactful way of having a positive climate and social impact as an individual, and telling your friends to do so as well. I'm always shouting about the nice bank that I use that doesn't finance fossil fuel expansion. And then Barclays, there's also a specific campaign around Barclays at the moment that Palestine Solidarity Campaign are running, specifically focused on their financing for weapons manufacturers. And this is a tactic that the reason I've got this nice black and white photo, it's quite historically unprecedented in the sense that during the apartheid South Africa, or the anti-apartheid South Africa movement in the UK, a big part of that was around trying to boycott the banks which were propping up the apartheid regime in South Africa, including Barclays. And I had a conversation with someone a while ago who said that Barclays have a really strong dip in their demographics. So people who I think are in their kind of 50s or 60s now, who switched their accounts in the 80s because of that campaign, have never gone back. And that's because another great fact about this is that you're much more likely to change spouse than you are to change bank. So if people move away, they don't come back. And banks like Barclays know that. And so it's a really good tool for leverage to show them that people are moving. So you can get involved with some of these campaigns. I think, again, if we think about those 100 companies that are causing all this mayhem, those fossil fuel companies in particular, that the financial system is propping up, it can feel a bit powerless as an individual because we're never going to be able to, with our individual level action, compete with the destruction of a company like Shell. It's really, really hard to have an equivalent positive impact to cancel theirs out. And so Make My Money Matter, which is another organization that people should definitely check out who work in this space. They've worked out that it's 21 times more powerful to switch to a green pension that doesn't invest in fossil fuels than going veggie, giving up flying, and switching energy provider combined. It's 21 times, has a 21 times greater impact to do that because of the way that this money flows into the fossil fuel companies that are having this disproportionately high impact. So if you're someone that doesn't want to make some of those individual changes, or if you know someone who doesn't, then you can say to them, well, have you thought about agitating and asking your workplace whether their default pension scheme is in a fund that invests in fossil fuels? And if not, taking on a bit of a project to find a pension provider that doesn't invest in fossil fuels. I just think that is a really, really staggering statistic that it's 21 times more powerful in terms of like emissions impact to switch your pension. So that one really shocked me. But it kind of makes sense when you think about it. So moving towards the end. So that's on the individual level. There's loads of things you can do. You can move your bank account. You can try and push for your workplace to change your default pension, or you can ask for your default pension pot to be moved specifically into a investment fund that doesn't fund fossil fuels. And then there are kind of actions that institutions can take. So if you're someone who has any influence over your university's investment policy, or an institution that you're connected to that invests and has an investment policy, you might want to ask them, are you doing anything around active stewardship? Which is a bit of a jargony buzzword, but it basically refers to, I mean, we've got a picture here of this football steward chasing a streaker, and that sums up what stewardship, I guess, is about. It's if one of the companies that you invest in is really, really doing something unacceptable, like the kind of ethical equivalent of streaking on a football pitch. Maybe that would be not paying workers a livable wage, having a massive gender pay gap, using resources in a very unsustainable way. Then as an investor, you can either just sit back and be passive and say, well, we're still getting our investment returns. The financial side is good, so we're not going to bother about any of these concerns. Or you can say, we're going to engage with that company and try and steward them actively towards better practices. So does the university's policy have anything in it that sort of relates to that? And does the university's investment manager do anything around active stewardship, active engagement? One example of that is something called AGM activism, which isn't always the most sexy or exciting, but AGM activism is basically one way that universities and any investor can have an impact on a company. So any company in the world, or lots of companies, particularly ones based in the UK, will have to hold an annual general meeting where they go through kind of key items of business, where they re-elect the board, where they review proposals that might have been submitted by shareholders. And so if you're an investor and you're a shareholder in that company and you're unsatisfied with what they're doing, you can submit a proposal. You can vote in favor of shareholder proposals which try and change company policy on various issues. You can ask for meetings with the leadership to discuss your concerns either before or after the event. And this is just one way that investors can make a real difference by publicly holding their investments and the companies they invest into account. So like I said, a shareholder proposal a shareholder resolution, sorry, is a policy, is a proposal to put to a company by shareholders, voted on at the AGM, and it puts a particular issue on the agenda. It might attract a media spotlight, and it can certainly prompt company action. And often, actually, even if the proposal doesn't get majority support, the fact that one was brought and received significant support from shareholders helps to put pressure on company leadership and has resulted in quite significant changes in company behavior. Just to give one example of this, Share Action, who I think I mentioned before, they work a lot on engaging with companies and using some of these investor levers to push for change. They filed a resolution at HSBC. I think they filed two in 2020 and 2021. And just a year later, the bank announced that it would stop financing fossil fuel expansion. So it would stop financing new fossil fuel projects directly, which isn't the same as not financing fossil fuel expansion for some quite boring, detailed reasons. But essentially, the pressure helped to produce quite a significant policy change in the bank. So that's one way in which you can use, as an investor, you can use your investor voice and power to not be passive like most investors are, but actually engage and try and push for a company to change their policies. So coming to the end, sorry, a lot of talking from me, but I wanted to cover quite a lot of ground. Key messages at the end of all of this. So we know the financial system is driving climate and social injustice. There's no doubt that the way our economy is currently structured around short-term profit making and a range of other kind of short-term incentives that don't necessarily center people and planetary well-being is having a massive impact on our lives and on the environment that supports human life. But we have huge power to change this. So moving our money, participating in boycotts, piling pressure onto mainstream financial institutions, voting for politicians who will legislate for a financial system that protects people and planet, pushing institutions that we're part of to change their policies and become more active investors to move their money out of the most polluting, most exploiting industries and into industries which are building a more secure, sustainable future. We can shift practices and policies. Making changes to your own finances is one of the most powerful things an individual or institution can do. It exceeds lots of the other lifestyle changes that we might know and think about as obvious things you can do to take action on the climate crisis. Very few people are always surprised when they say to me, "What can I do?" And I don't say go vegetarian. I say change your bank account, change your pension. But these are massively impactful actions that you can take. So I guess, yeah, if there's a final message before I open for any questions, it's switch your bank, green your organization's pension, encourage your institution, if it has investments, to engage in robust active stewardship techniques. And for detail on any of these things, because it's been a bit of a whistle stop, we run a campaign which is all about changing the investment system, and it's called Invest for Change, and I'm the contact for that. So my email is there. If anyone has any questions about any of the points that have been raised in the session, and now I can shut up, and if anyone has any questions, then feel free to pop them in the chat or unmute, and I'm really happy to answer them. Yeah, Masatora.
Oh yeah. Thank you for this presentation today. Like this is quite interesting for me. Okay, just I have one question. Like recently, some banks like some like some like bank like mm, uh, tell the stakeholder which company they pour money, but some company doesn't publish those kind of
I think your audio is
information.
breaking up a little bit. Do
So,
you mind maybe
sorry.
putting your question in the chat, and I'll take Drew's first.
Okay.
Go on to yours. Sorry about that. Drew, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I'm slightly I am on board with this, but I'm slightly confused because of, I don't know if you heard of the organization Positive Money. I'm not like, I'm kind of convinced that this is a good idea, but I'm not sure that the justification is right, because my understanding is that banks don't really don't really invest money that is deposited with them, right? They're just creating money when they create a loan. And like, it's not clear how much retail or institutional deposits make a difference in, I guess, their balance sheet at the end of the day. Given that most of the loans are essentially based on confidence. So like, it's an imprecise question, but if you know enough about Positive Money, then maybe it will make sense. And if you don't, then we can take the discussion offline.
No, I think it's a really good and important point. And I guess this is something that's interesting about campaigning and action in this area, because some of it is about a really direct financial impact. If you're divesting, this gets a bit nerdy, but if you're divesting from primary market investments, you are cutting off direct financing for things like fossil fuel expansion. But if you're divesting from stocks and shares, you're not actually taking money away from the company in a material way because someone else just buys your share. But what you're doing as a prominent public investor is essentially like expressing a vote of no confidence in that company that has an impact on how that company is perceived, on whether governments feel that they need to intervene in that company or that industry. And so there's that kind of sort of secondary, what we call like a social license effect. And in the same way with account switching, it's not necessarily about the money, the actual money in our bank account being used directly to finance fossil fuel expansion. It's about the public trying to send a signal to those banks that they're going to lose business, and sending a signal to policymakers and government and so on that that activity isn't going to be tolerated and is going to cause other consequences for the bank. That's my understanding of kind of theory of change there. And so this other question in the chat before we close: how do we ask banks to disclose investment information about which companies they invest in compared to others? Okay, so it can be challenging. I mean, a good indication is if you look at their most banks will have fairly publicly available policies around areas that they might exclude investment in. So for instance, lots of banks would have publicly available information about not investing in certain forms of coal, or not investing in weapons which are banned under international treaties. So usually information about what they won't invest in is available online. And there are also lots of published reports which dig into the detail and try and come up with more easily digestible sort of collections of information about where banks are investing. So there's a really good report that comes out each year called Banking on Climate Chaos. There's also a report that comes out there's a report called Banking on the Bomb. So that there are publicly available sources of information, but it can be very tricky. And I would suggest, I mean, as a client of a bank, if you're using them for personal or institutional financial services, asking them whether they invest in an area of concern for you might be a good step in and of itself, to show that their clients care about this, and you may well get some information back. So I'll hold if there are any more questions. People can raise their hand or unmute, but if not, I think we might bring this to an end because we're coming up to 4. Okay. And we are recording the session, so that will be sent round. Okay. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. Sorry, it was a lot of listening. And yeah, take care. Have a great rest of your day.